Welcome, Game Chasers everywhere, to episode 36 of the Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero. And I'm back this week with another compilation. You know I love my compilations, especially my retro-infused ones, and we've got a nice doozy of one. But first, of course, just a reminder that we are now on a bi-weekly format for the Collecting Confidant going forward, which gives me a bit more flexibility in terms of the games I want to cover, and also just a bit of personal news. It's been kind of a crazy 2 weeks because, of course, I just got engaged to the love of my life. So, Julia, love you very much, and thank you for saying yes. But, of course, this is a video game channel, so let's stop gushing and get back to the games. All right. So, this week we're going to be covering a limited run release. This is an anthology of old Konami arcade classics called the Arcade Classics Anniversary Collection, which is the third installment in the Anniversary Collection series from Konami, including the Castlevania collection and the Contra collection. This one is an homage to its old shoot-'em-ups and some other stuff from the 80s, all in one collection of 8 games with some Japanese counterparts, and is now available for physical pre-order on the Nintendo Switch and the PS4 until Sunday, December the 25th, at the standard limited runs deadline of 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But of course, if you do want to get this digitally, you can also get this on the Xbox One and the PC. The original release date was April the 18th of 2019, but it's now finally getting a physical release on the PS4 and the Switch. So I'm going to cover the compilation from an overview perspective in terms of what it offers in terms of features and content, and then we're going to trace each individual game, including the differences between the Japanese counterparts where applicable. So, the Arcade Classics Anniversary Collection, like I said, came back out in 2019, and even though this is a 3-year-old compilation, by 2022 standards, is already starting to show its age in terms of being somewhat bare bones. I mean, the content is fantastic, but even then, from a content perspective, because this is just including a bunch of old arcade games from the 80s, I feel like it could have included a bit more, and I can see what Konami's intending to do with this, because inside of the compilation itself, it also includes a digital manual, which includes some really cool stuff like assets and drawings and pre-production schematics for each of the games, but also includes some interviews with some of the Konami staff, and even has a section asking them, if there was a volume 2 of this collection, what games would you like to see included? I see that as a bit of a cash grab, especially in light of what Konami was able to pull off in the more recently released Cowabunga collection, which I covered quite a few videos ago, and just is jam-packed full of content. And really that comes down to the fact that Digital Clips did this compilation, whereas Konami did the Anniversary Classics collection. So a bit of a different development approach. But even then, now with Digital Clips on the horizon, really upping the ante for what compilations can do, especially the Atari 50 compilation, which recently came out. I'll be covering this in a few videos from now. This includes just so much content, over 100 games, that really, I feel that Konami probably could have included a few more titles on this and just did it as 1 volume rather than as 2 volumes. But regardless, what is actually here on the Arcade Classics Anniversary Collection is fantastic. Really has an incredible slice of shoot-'em-up lore and what was important to the genre, and we're going to be covering all of that. So overall, from a compilation perspective, like I said, it includes that digital manual and then has some of the traditional features, like, for example, with each of the games, you can have different filters to give it kind of like a CRT effect on the screen, different screen borders you can employ. You have save and load functions, so if you're in the middle of a really punishing run of one of these games, you can at least save your progress, but doesn't include like rewind features or play along features. So again, you have to look at this from the perspective that this is a 3-year-old compilation, and that the expectations for our compilations have definitely increased in the last few years. So I would say going forward, I'm hoping that Konami will put a little bit more effort into the user interface and some of the bells and whistles, but what's here is pretty solid. So let's get into it. We'll start off with the first of the 8 games that are featured here, and really 6 of the games have Japanese counterparts, and in some cases, they're so markedly different that I'll almost say you're getting 14 games technically with this compilation. But the first one is a standout, one of the most important. It was actually described back in 1990 by Konami's founder, Kaz Kazuki, as their most important game to date. And I can see why, because Scramble from 1981 is really the precursor to what Gradius would eventually become, and we'll get into that more later. This is actually considered to be one of the first side-scrolling shooters. It actually wasn't the first, because Defender actually came out 2 months prior to this and set the standard, but this was the first side-scrolling shooter to use forced scrolling. So that was kind of like what it brought innovation-wise to the genre. And it's a very simple concept. So you're basically just a fighter jet that has to get to the enemy base over 6 stages with 3 lives, no continues. You can earn additional lives, but all you're outfitted with is just unlimited shooting ammo, unlimited missiles that you can shoot onto ground targets, and simply just your dexterity as a great pilot. So let's get into it. Essentially, the gameplay is you'll travel across 6 stages, which you can actually see at the top of your screen. So it's really nice that you can actually see your progression, which gives you a visual to how close you're getting towards your goal. And what I like about this game is that there's no cutscenes or pauses between the stages. It's just one single mission that you have to run through, beat the game, and then you'll start over again from a higher difficulty level. So it kind of makes it very intense and addictive. I would actually say this is one of the most addictive games on the whole compilation. I spent a lot of time with this, and it's very simple. You'll just be shooting enemies for points and then shooting mysterious objects for extra points. But then the other thing is you also have to shoot fuel canisters to keep your aircraft afloat. So that introduces a very interesting mechanic there. And of course, there are no power-ups. So it's just very simplified, but would set the standard for a lot of shoot-'em-ups to come, especially Gradius, which would come out a few years later. And this is actually the precursor to Gradius. So we're going to get more into that game later as we proceed throughout the compilation. But Scramble, even though it's very simple, very addictive, and I highly recommend starting with this one before you delve into the other titles if you haven't played these before. Moving down the line chronologically, the next game on the compilation is 1985's Twin B, which was a Japanese-only arcade version. There's only one version of this game on here because it didn't actually come out in North America till much later. This game was one of the precursors to the shoot-'em-up genre, along with Sega's Fantasy Zone, and this is why this game had kind of a wider appeal when it first hit, because of the very bright, vibrant colors and the cool characters, which actually had more of an attraction to female players. So that was kind of its claim to fame. Plus, unlike Scramble, which was single player only, this introduced 2-player simultaneous co-op. So like Scramble, this game is very hardcore. Again, you only get 3 lives with, of course, you can upgrade more lives as you get more points, but there's no continues. So you have to get through all the stages in one go. And this is actually a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up with a missile function similar to Namco's Xevious, where you can shoot enemies in front of you, but also drop bombs on ground targets as well. And then what happens in this is that the way you power up your guns is you actually shoot clouds, and then there will be little hidden bells that will pop out of them, and they can change color. So when the bells originally come out, they'll be golden color, and if you collect those right off the bat, you'll get a score bonus. But if you decide to shoot the bells, then that's where they start to change colors and give you different types of power-ups, whether it's adding extra ships to your repertoire or getting a twin gun or a shield. There's lots of cool power-ups you can do. And then also in terms of score multipliers, you can bomb out enemies on the ground, get different fruits, which will add score to your multipliers, and also collect stars, which will be like a screen clearing bomb. So this game is, again, very hardcore, deceptively simple because it is a shoot 'em up, but it is very challenging. It can get a little cooler in co-op mode because you can combine firepower with your teammate on screen and really unleash devastating attacks. It's got bosses and is overall a lot of fun, and would set the standard for what would come later in Konami's Typhoon, aka Ajax, which I'll be covering a little bit later in this video. So that's Twin B, available only in Japan for the longest time, and then finally got a North American release on the DS in 2007 in a Konami compilation. But now, of course, you can enjoy it in all of its arcade glory here on this new compilation. So that was Twin B out of 85. Moving on to game number 3, we're still in 1985. This is one of the showpieces of the compilation because this is one of the most important games that lays the foundation for the shoot 'em up genre. We are, of course, talking about Nemesis, aka Gradius, which was the first game in this beloved series. And what's funny about this is originally intended to be a sequel to Scramble. It was originally called Scramble 2, but then they decided to make it its own animal. But what's nice about it is that it retains a lot of the assets and mechanics from Scramble that laid the foundation for what would come in Gradius. So with this one, you are now piloting the Vic Viper, the famed trans-dimensional spaceship, as you're taking on the Bacterian Empire. And like Scramble, you get 3 lives, but this time you get a limited number of continues. 3 to be exact in the North American version, and this is where we start to get into some of the marked differences between the Japanese and the North American versions, because like I said, in North America, this was known as Nemesis, but then you also get access to the Japanese version, which was called Gradius, and then that's basically what the nomenclature for what the series would be therein. But the North American version, you get 3 continues, right? So when you die, you'll basically start at a recent checkpoint, lose all your power-ups, but get a chance to reclaim them. Let's talk about the mechanics though, because this was very revolutionary for the time, where in other shooters you would get different types of power-ups that would change your gun type. This one opts instead for a power bar meter at the bottom of the screen, where all the power-up capsules you collect are the same color and same type, and really they're used as more of a currency to move your way through this power meter from left to right. So let me explain. At the leftmost region of the power meter, you'll have a speed option, and then next to that, you'll have a missile option, and after that, you have all your different guns and your shields. So the way this works is when you collect a power-up capsule, it will light up options from left to right. So for example, let's say you collect 1 power-up capsule, it'll light up the speed option, and then you have a button that you can choose to activate the power-up, or you can choose not to activate the power-up, collect another power-up capsule, and that will move the indicator from left to right to the next available option in the power bar. So let's say you don't want the speed option, but you want to wait to get the missile option. You'll have to collect 2 power-up capsules and then activate the missile option, and then whatever power-up you decide to activate will send the power-up meter back to the left, and you'll start collecting power-up capsules again to decide which power-up you want to activate. So again, very innovative for its time, and would set the stage for later titles in Gradius. And of course, the game is punishingly difficult. Like I said, you only get 3 continues in this, whereas in the Japanese version, there are no continues. So arguably a lot harder on the Japanese version, which is actually called Gradius, but I would say after having played both a bit extensively, I'd say the Japanese AI is a little more forgiving, which gives you that balance. You can either go with the harder North American Nemesis version with the 3 continues, or the slightly less difficult Japanese version but with no continues. And of course, in the options menu, there are ways to lower or raise the difficulty, add more continues and lives in most respects, so you can tailor the game to your level of playing style. But overall, a very difficult game, but very influential, and spawned many sequels and spin-offs, which we're going to get into. Of course, next up on the list, we have 1986's Life Force, aka Salamander in Japan. So you'll get the North American version, which is Life Force, and then the Japanese counterpart, Salamander, which are 2 very visually distinct games, and again, 2 different experiences based on how you're playing them. So Life Force was actually a spin-off of Gradius, where you're still piloting the Vic Viper and taking on the Bacterian Empire, but now this time, not only do they get rid of the continue system, so you only have 3 lives, which makes it a little bit more punishing, but now they get rid of the power bar system at the bottom and opt for a more traditional, simplified power-up system, where you're collecting orbs to increase the amount of guns you have, and then other tokens to increase your speed and your ammo type. This game, I'd say, is a lot more difficult than Gradius. I had a kind of a tough time with this one, but what I liked about this was how, again, it innovates and adds more fundamentals to the Gradius series going forward, especially considering that this game is not just a side-scrolling shooter, but it can actually switch to vertically scrolling, and this would become a staple of future Gradius titles going forward. And this game is definitely very memorable. It was one of the most popular NES titles, had quite the following back in the day, and definitely has some charm. Even though it's very difficult, at least it has some quality of life stuff that when you die, you start right back where you died and you have a chance to collect some of your power-ups to get yourself back in the game. But I will tell you, if on your first run, you're maxing out your firepower and getting through there and you die and lose some of your power-ups, good luck. You're going to have a really tough time picking up from where you left off. So this game's pretty hardcore, but still a lot of fun and a great spinoff of Gradius. Moving forward through the list, we have game number 5, 1987's Typhoon in North America, also known as Ajax in Japan. You get both versions here. And I would describe this as the more hardcore version of Twin B. And what's cool about this game is that it's actually divided into vertically scrolling shoot 'em up sequences, which again are taken right out of Twin B. You can drop bombs on ground enemies and shoot at enemies in front of you, grab power-ups, but then there's other stages where you go into like a 3D on-rails jet fighting mode similar to Afterburner, and this was pretty cool at the time because it was using a lot of those scaling effects that would become popularized by the Super Nintendo many years later. So technically, this was quite the marvel back in the day, and I'm going to say, I have a love-hate relationship with this game because as soon as I plugged in the North American version, where in that one, level 1, you automatically go into the 3D jet fighter levels, I thought it was intense. Again, reminded me of Afterburner, and I was really enjoying it. But then you start getting into these 2D vertically scrolling levels, which are just utterly punishingly difficult. I'm going to say that this is probably, other than Life Force, one of the most difficult games on this compilation. And I'm going to say too that the checkpoint system on the North American version, known as Typhoon, is laid out in such a way that it's so brutal to get to that next checkpoint. Whereas in the Japanese version, I find that not only the AI, but the checkpoint layout system is a bit more forgiving. So I opted more for that version. Thankfully, this game provides unlimited continues. So you can just keep inserting coins, keep progressing through until you eventually beat the 8 levels. So it's great to see this included here, but it is definitely going to test your patience. Moving on down the line, we are on to game number 6 now, and this is the odd man out. And I understand why they probably put this in because Castlevania is such a big deal to Konami, but the fact that all the other games on this are shoot 'em ups and that we get like a 2D style platform in the middle of this is a little odd, but it's welcome. Of course, we're talking about Haunted Castle. And you also get the Japanese version known as Akumajo Dracula. This is the second entry in the Castlevania series for arcades. The first entry being Versus Castlevania, which was essentially just an arcade port of the original NES Castlevania, whereas this is built from the ground up with way better graphics for the time. And it's kind of like a precursor to what you would see in Castlevania 4 and Castlevania Bloodlines with larger sprites, very detailed animations and graphics, but man, is this game punishing. So essentially what you're doing here is you're playing as Simon Belmont across 6 stages. Your bride, Selena, after your wedding, gets kidnapped by Dracula, and it's just a very simple plot where you gotta survive 6 stages and some of your typical cast of Castlevania villains like skeletons, zombies, mermen, bats, and such. You're going to go across these 6 stages armed with whip in hand, and eventually you can upgrade that whip to a Morning Star and then a sword. Plus, you'll have your typical Castlevania sub-weapons like bombs and boomerangs and such. And what's different about this is that traditionally in Castlevania games, you'll collect hearts by whipping candles in the background, whereas this, you're simply just destroying enemies to get your hearts to power up your sub-weapon. But like I said, this game is very difficult. It retains that stiffness and that precision of control that you're so used to from Castlevania games, but because it's an arcade game, just really ramps that difficulty level up. And this is one of the few games on the compilation where you can see stark differences between the North America and Japanese versions. I'm going to say that typically I find that the Japanese versions are usually harder, whereas in this one, the North American version is just punishing and unforgiving. You take a lot more damage from enemy hits. The patterns of the enemy AI are a little weirder. Like, for example, in the North American version, the bats have this really radical arc motion, whereas in the Japanese version, it's a lot more subdued and easier to pinpoint. And in the Japanese version, you also take a lot less damage from enemy hits. So I'd say overall, it's the less frustrating version of the two, but regardless, each game has unlimited continues, so you can slog through it at your own pace. Plus, it has a 2-player alternating option as well, so you can take turns with a friend and try to get through this game. And again, if you're a Castlevania fan, this is something that's very rare, and most of us haven't played until this point, unless you played it as the Arcade Archives version on the Switch or PS4. So I'm glad to see it included, even though it is a little odd to have it in the mix of all these other shoot-'em-ups. So that's Haunted Castle from '86. Moving forward, we're on to title number 7. So this one is Vulcan Venture in North America, otherwise known as Gradius 2, Gopher no Yabu for the Japanese version. This came out in 1988 and is a direct sequel to Gradius 1, whereas Life Force / Salamander was a spin-off. This is a direct sequel, but what's nice about this is it takes a lot of cues from what Life Force established and kind of combines the two games into one. So, like the original Gradius, you're still going to have a lot of the same mechanics. You'll have that power-up bar at the beginning that you have to upgrade through collecting capsules. But then, what's nice about this too is that before you start the game, you have 4 selectable loadouts to comprise that power bar, plus 2 shield types. So you'll have your traditional Gradius shield, which will put one on the front, can absorb enemy damage only from the front of the ship, but now you also have the option to get a force field, which protects your entire ship, but can only take 3 different hits. So you have a lot more different strategy in this in terms of the loadout you select and the shield type, plus, forgivingly, this offers unlimited continues in the North American version only. So, like with Gradius, if you die, you start at a checkpoint without your power-ups, and then a whole bunch of orange enemies show up, giving you the chance to reclaim at least a few power-ups before you get back into the fray, whereas in the Japanese version, you only get a limited amount, technically making the Japanese version a bit tougher than the North American version. And the other big standout about this is that it also borrows the verticality of Life Force, where you'll notice early on when you're at this fiery planet stage that you'll be side-scrolling, but then all of a sudden you have all these multiple pathways you can take by moving up and down through the screen, giving a sense of giant scope to the gameplay we hadn't seen before in Gradius, and really making it big and exciting, and I really enjoyed my time with this one. So that's Gradius 2. Really thankful for its inclusion on this one. Now, finally, let's move into the final game on this compilation, which is 1988's Thundercross, and this was one of my favorites in terms of its intensity and sheer firepower, but it's also going to depend again on which of the 2 versions you play, because both the North American version and the Japanese versions are included on this, and they're both labeled equally as Thundercross, but they're 2 almost totally different games, and I'll explain why. The North American version, when you start it, automatically you start with multiple guns and 3 screen clearing missiles called Little Babies. And essentially what it is just like a side-scrolling linear shooter where you collect different guns and can have up to 4 extra guns on top and on bottom of your ship, plus these 3 screen clearing missiles. And graphically, this was pretty cool at the time because in 1988, parallax scrolling wasn't really a thing, so it employs actually a lot of this. So you actually see like a lot of different backgrounds in the screen scrolling at different speeds, which actually adds a lot of 3-dimensional depth to this. And it's a very pretty game. And of course, there is a boss system, but very similar to Ikaruga, there is a chance that if you don't destroy the boss in time, that the boss can escape and you'll lose out on that score bonus. Also, in terms of quality of life, there are unlimited continues, so it is possible to see this game through to completion, even if you suck like myself, and I actually did finish this game because it really drew me in. But then, the Japanese version is so much different, whereas when I turned that one on, when you start the game, you only start off with 1 gun, and there are no missiles, and you really have to earn those extra guns. But I think that's from a balancing perspective, because I noticed that in the Japanese version, the AI is a little bit easier. So I think that in order to counterbalance it, the North American version was definitely a lot more difficult, and that's why they give you a lot more firepower up front, plus those screen clearing missiles. And again, lends credence to my argument that there are really technically 14 games on this compilation rather than 8 because of the marked differences between the Japanese and North American versions. So from that perspective, you are getting a lot of value, but overall, I think they still could have included a lot more titles on this rather than trying to nickel and dime consumers for 2 separate volumes. I think they could have just included everything in one, especially like I'm saying, when I cover this game, you're going to see there's over 100 games on this Atari 50 compilation, including Jaguar, arcade, remakes. At this point, there's really no excuse with the amount of memory you can fit on a disc or cart or on a digital download. But again, what is here is fantastic. There are some nice quality of life things you can do in terms of the screen filters, the saving loading. So overall, I still recommend it from the perspective of like it's an incredible slice of arcade history. There are some truly incredible games here. If you are a shoot 'em up fan, you need to have Gradius, Life Force, all these games in your compilation, and especially from a Castlevania perspective, having Haunted Castle is great. So like I said, if you want to get the physical copy of this on the PS4 or Switch, you can do that now until Sunday, December 25th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There are going to be 3 versions available. Of course, there'll be your typical standard version for $34.99, which is either the cart for the Switch or the disc for the PS4. But then for the super fans, you can go to a mid-tier classic edition, which comes in your classic big box silver Konami box with a retro style dust sleeve, like a little NES style thing that you can put your game into, and a CD soundtrack with all the compositions. And of course, that classic edition is going to go for $64.99 US. But then for all of you mega fans who want to go for the ultimate collector's edition for $159.99, you'll get everything that was included in the classic edition, including a miniature arcade replica cabinet, some arcade tokens, and a hardcover book. So overall, some really cool value if you want to go for that massive version. But there are, of course, standard versions if you don't want to pony up all that dough. So definitely a great compilation. I can definitely recommend it from a historical perspective, but I'm hoping down the line that Konami will take more cues from what Digital Eclipse did on the Cowabunga collection and just include a better user interface, more content, but I can definitely see that from the standards being upped. This has been a jam-packed episode of The Collecting Confidant, episode 36. Thank you again for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Later, Game Chasers, and peace.